The second season of the Castle Rock series on Hulu predominantly focuses on Annie Wilkes, the author-obsessed serial-killing former nurse from the novel Misery. And there is no shortage of additional familiar Stephen King-verse settings, locations, and characters. But not only do the screenwriters of Castle Rock disregard the previously established lore that King has so intricately crafted over the course of his writing career, were you to change the names of the people and the places and remove their connections to King's bibliography entirely, almost nothing in the 10-episode season would be noticeably impacted. And, well, depending on how you look at it, that could be a good or bad thing. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. If you're into Stephen King, scary stuff, and the deconstruction of shows that pander to fandoms in the most low effort of ways while somehow still being unpredictable and entertaining, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This is the third and final video in the Misery series on this channel. The first video was, of course, for the 1987 novel that introduced readers to Annie Wilkes. The second video was for the 1990 feature-length film that made Annie Wilkes a horror icon thanks to Kathy Bates' commanding performance, and this video will be about the second series of the second season of the Castle Rock series that debuted on Hulu in 2019 and provides us with a prequel of sorts for Misery that almost entirely abandons the history of Annie Wilkes that was firmly established in both the novel and the feature-length film, and tells a very different story that kind of works and kind of doesn't. At least, not when it comes to aligning itself with the existing history as King wrote it. And Misery isn't the only King story that the show includes to some extent or another that the writers don't seem all that concerned about in regards to strictly or even loosely adhering to the source material. And, well, it all still works for the most part, somehow. So I neglected to cover the first season of Castle Rock, which as it turns out, I should have done as a part of my Shawshank series, so I'm kind of doing things bass-ackwards, and we'll be covering Castle Rock Season 1 in my next video, because doing things in order would have been too easy, I guess. But before we get into Season 2 and the show itself, let's talk for a moment about what the goal of Castle Rock was, what led to the production of the show, critical reception, and why the show never made it beyond its second season. Castle Rock, history and background. Castle Rock, the notorious fictional Maine town, which is very familiar to anyone who considers themselves a constant reader, has been the setting of many a King story, starting with The Dead Zone in 1979 and continuing with regularity throughout the following decades and reappearing as recently as 2022 in Gwendy's Final Task. King would establish the lore, geography, and cast of characters that make up Castle Rock, creating a sort of multifaceted universe that intricately intertwined a number of his stories. More than a dozen separate threads would be knit together over time to form a vast, elaborate tapestry, and it was this complex tangle of tales that inspired the show's creators to conceive of Castle Rock. Castle Rock was the brainchild of Dustin Thomason and Sam Shaw. Both Thomason and Shaw have fairly light filmographies, with Thomason's credits including co-creating The Evidence for ABC, writing and executive producing the show Lie to Me for Fox, as well as WGN America's Manhattan. Thomason also co-wrote the best-selling 2004 novel The Rule of Four, which sold over 4 million copies, making it the best-selling debut novel of the decade. Shaw's credits include writing for Showtime's series Master of Sex, which is something I'm going to have to check out, as well as the aforementioned Manhattan series alongside Thomason. Before I move on, I just want to say how impressive the writing for this show is, regardless of the fact that a lot of the story is only vaguely King adjacent. Thomason and Shaw did an admirable job. Castle Rock was executive produced by Thomason and Shaw, as well as well-known writer, director, and producer J.J. Abrams, Liz Glotzer, who has been president of Rob Reiner's Castle Rock Productions since 1996, and Stephen King himself. Castle Rock was predominantly filmed on location in Massachusetts, which is close enough to Maine, and upon release, both seasons received generally positive reviews from audiences and critics alike. In fact, both seasons hold favorable ratings on Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic, so it seems the show was a rousing success. However, Hulu pulled the plug on Castle Rock in November of 2020 with no real explanation, so it's safe to assume that despite the positive reception, not enough people were actually watching. I can't speak on the first season yet, but as far as the cast, score, special effects, storyline, and overall horror thriller vibes go, season 2 is consistently decent. There are some sillier moments and oversights in continuity that maybe don't hold up to scrutiny, but the majority of the show was enjoyable. But is it really and truly based on the characters and the Castle Rock that Stephen King wrote into existence? Kinda, sorta, but not really. Appropriation of a legacy. First and foremost, I want to once again point out that Stephen King was directly involved in this show, so anything the writers changed, adapted, or created from whole cloth likely had his blessing. Secondly, going off-book when adapting King stories to the screen is expected and not something that bothers me at this point, though I admit it used to bother me a great deal. But even the best adaptations that have played out very closely to the source material end up making at least a small handful of changes, and that's simply par for the course. But Castle Rock Season 2 doesn't just go off-book. It reimagines characters, histories, and entire stories entirely. As someone who expected this to be a prequel to Misery, there were a number of elements that straight out of the gate dispelled that assumption. Castle Rock Season 2 takes place in the modern day, or at least somewhere thereabouts. There are smartphones, laptops, the internet, new cars that weren't around when Misery and Annie Wilkes were originally introduced into the world, and so we become aware right away that this isn't going to be the history lesson of Annie Wilkes pre the Paul Sheldon incident that we may have been expecting. This is a whole new Annie Wilkes, though some attributes and milestones do remain intact. Additionally, in the Misery novel and movie, we learn of Annie Wilkes' history in the medical profession, as well as a string of deaths that she is quite probably responsible for. But in the show, Castle Rock, Annie is a nurse, and we see her traveling across the country taking job after job at various hospitals and hastily moving on, but it's not because she has a twisted urge to kill her patients. Rather, she ducks in and out of these institutions in order to procure, or more aptly, to steal the medications that keep her auditory and visual hallucinations at bay. And she did liberate medications in the novel, but she sure didn't seem to be using them for her own mental health reasons. These changes were likely made as a way to keep us empathetic toward who is ultimately the main protagonist of the story in Season 2. It would be hard to root for someone who is killing the sick, the elderly, and eventually infants willy-nilly for kicks or out of some doing the Lord's work narrative. To be clear, in the Castle Rock series, we find out that Annie has killed in her past, and she goes on to murder someone in the most outrageously horrible and simultaneously enjoyable way in the first episode of Castle Rock's second season. But it is due to a series of unfortunate accidents, mental trauma, and out of a perceived sense of imminent danger that she does these things. She's no longer an unhinged killer with a potential god complex, and instead she is a victim of circumstance, childhood trauma, and debilitating mental health issues. Now, Misery and Annie Wilkes aren't the only King story to get a wildly off-book, unique revision in this season. The story of Salem's Lot is heavily involved in the series as well, but not necessarily in the way you'd expect. One of my regular viewers had left a comment on a previous video about how Castle Rock Season 2 saw Annie Wilkes go up against the Salem's Lot vampires, but I'm afraid there are no vampires in this show. Salem's Lot, the town, is a part of the show, and even the Marston house is vital to the plot, which is of course a key setting from Salem's Lot. However, it's the town's and the Marston house's inhabitants that have been changed. Kurt Barlow and his coven of blood-sucking creatures of the night have been exchanged with the spirits of a cult of French settlers who, in a mass suicide, took their own lives at the behest of a chosen individual who was confronted by an interdimensional time-traveling angel demon who is seemingly speaking to her directly via a telepathic link of sorts and instructs her to kill and bury her entire legion of followers in order to be resurrected 400 years later by possessing the bodies of the residents of Jerusalem's Lot. So just a slight adjustment there. But here's the thing. In this instance, in regards to Salem's Lot, we can assume that the vampire stuff had already happened, and that the Marston house, this monument to evil, as King calls it in the Salem's Lot novel, has now become the residence of a different breed of monster. It's natural enough. But when it comes to Misery and Annie Wilkes, there's no real continuity with the timeline. In fact, Annie Wilkes, the Marston house, even the name of the towns, hell, even the name of the show itself, remove all of that, and the story doesn't really change at all. Were you to take out the fan service, the stuff King readers like myself are there to see, change the character names and the town names, etc., the show is still a mostly watchable horror thriller series that anyone who is into that sort of thing could enjoy, and that's kind of smart, right? They figure out a way to make it so the average viewer with no knowledge of or understanding of the intricacies of Castle Rock lore or Stephen King's bibliography could still enjoy the show while still piquing the interest of the fandom. It's possible to watch the show without any idea who Annie Wilkes is or who Ace Merrill is, without knowing about the history of Salem's Lot or Castle Rock or the Marston house. And it's all still understandable. Is the show better if you are familiar with all the details? I guess so, but only because it allows us those I know what this is from moments that play on our nostalgia and perhaps make us feel smart or validated for recognizing people, places, things, and other nouns from King's books. Castle Rock Season 2 isn't a perfect representation of King's work, but it was never trying to be. It's a full reimagining, and in that department, they didn't go so far off the beaten path that it's unrecognizable, but they strayed far enough that King fans especially won't know quite where they'll take things, and that's not a bad thing if you ask me. Final thoughts. If you're someone who insists that your Stephen King adaptations be pure and true to the original story, then this show will be an absolute nightmare for you. Don't bother, you'll hate it. But if you're just looking for a decent horror thriller series that goes to some unpredictable places with a talented cast and an overall high-quality production value, you should give it a watch. It's a shame they never made it beyond season 2, especially considering how well received the series was, and with the endless number of stories that the show could have pulled from. I would have liked to have seen just how wild they got with their reimaginings. I guess I'm going to do Castle Rock Season 1 for my next video, which has a lot to do with Shawshank Prison and also the multi-dimensional time travel angel demon from Season 2 plays a major part in Season 1, but from what I can from what I can remember, he is the only character to carry over from the first season into the second season. But also my memory is terrible, so I don't know if I actually know what the fuck I'm talking about, so I'm gonna say goodbye now. New videos drop every other week on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so click the subscriber bell to get notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty please with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.